We are not recording. All right, so today I think what we're going to do is walk through some of the Azure stuff and how to deploy this app. Now, there's a couple gotchas here. I'll start sharing my screen out. Let's see. Can you guys see that?
Yep.
Cool.
Yeah, now.
Got it. So what I think the plan is for today is to deploy into Azure. And I was working with Polera this morning, and I actually do have the Azure Gov Cloud access, and I did get permission to deploy to that. The problem is that I can't link my Azure DevOps account into that because I don't have the correct permissions to do that. So what I can do is publish this to my personal public Azure instance, Azure Cloud. But the gotcha there is we can't spin up new SQL databases because of the whole COVID-19 thing. They're not allowing SQL resources to be created in these kind of free tiers at the moment. So we're not, unfortunately, going to be able to get a full working example done, but I think walking through the mechanics, and the only thing is the app's just not going to start up at the end of the day because there's going to be no SQL database backing it. But I still think there's a lot of benefit in looking at how everything gets deployed, what we have to do in our code to get it somewhat production or deployment ready. I thought we'd walk through the Azure pipelines on how we created a build that's going to be ready to publish. We're going to create a release in Azure DevOps that will actually push all the code to Azure. So does that sound good? Any questions on any of that? And like always, feel free to kind of interject as we go here because I think a lot of this might be new to some folks. Some of you guys might be real familiar with this. I'm not sure kind of where the whole audience is today. So before we get started, any questions on what we're setting out to attempt to accomplish? Does that sound good? Does that sound like something that's worthwhile?
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay. So one of the things that we had to do, I'll preface this with, I did walk through this yesterday, and Tom Navarro gave me a hand for a little bit, and we just kind of got a single PR out there and created a build and release pipeline just so we weren't kind of fumbling through that today, but I would like to just step through what we did. So one of the things that we had to do was everywhere in the app where we were using localhost : whatever, we needed to abstract that into some sort of configuration. So when the app would actually run on a server, we could determine what that URL would be. So let me bring up the code for that. So remember here, this used to be, localhost : whatever the port was /post /create. But now what we want to do is pull that out of a configuration file. So in React or kind of any front-end language or framework that you want to use, you can use a library called .env. So Parcel Bundler that we're using to bundle our code together is aware of that. So if I add a .env file, I can add kind of a list of variables in here that I would want. So locally, when I'm running, I want this to be localhost : port /API. And then anywhere that I want to use that, I can just say process.env. the name of whatever variable that I created in here. So does that make sense? Kind of similar to the app settings in .NET that we set up for the API, but this is just for the front-end code. Another change that we made in the actual app itself was I just created a simple base API controller. So this base API controller now says any route is going to be API / the controller name. So then our blog controller is just going to inherit from base API controller, and our post controller, same thing. And if I spin this up, you'll see here in Swagger, everything is now API /. So I did that in order to not confuse our client-side routing when we get to that with our server-side routing, which is everything that we send back to the API is going to be /API/whatever. Does that make sense? Okay. So if we flip back to this, what's happening here, and the reason that we want to do this is because at build time, that's when this variable gets put into the output JavaScript file. So if we were to look here in the dist, and it's going to create this app, this is the fully compiled code. And you can see that it plugged in here this localhost 44360/API because the environment, the .env file contained that, and that's where it's used within code. So when we go do this from the build server and we have the build server do a build for us, we can plug in API URL of something else, and if we go look at the JavaScript file, we'll see whatever that's going to be. Any questions on that? You guys familiar with the .env files from Angular or any other kind of React app or Vue? I think you can use all those. You can use those in those languages, or those frameworks, but they might have some other built-in stuff as well. I'm not entirely sure how Vue handles that.
Yeah, it's pretty similar.
Okay. So, at work, perhaps you have different flavors of that, like a .env.development, .env.test, .env.prod. There's different ways of handling that, but since we're going to be deploying this to Azure and using Azure DevOps, we should be able to just plug in the variable at build time, and it will plug it in for us. So we'll take a look at that. Trying to see anything else that we did as part of that PR. Oh, yes. The other thing that we did in startup was added a couple of things here. So we have use default files and use static files, as well as this little piece of middleware that we wrote. So I want to explain what's going on there. So what we're doing is, maybe I'll open Notepad and we'll try to explain it in here. Right now we have like our API project, right? And that's going to build and give us all the API.dlls and files like that, right? Then we have our React app, which we build, and we end up with an app.javascript file and an index.html file. So what we want to do in .NET is there's that www root folder that exists. And anything that gets put in here, we can render or we can serve up via the API itself. So ultimately, what our goal is for now is we want to get that app.js and index.html that the React build does, and we ultimately want to come up and put it and nest it in this www root directory. So that's what our build is going to do. Other ways that we could accomplish that are we could deploy the API to its own app service, or like if you think about it at work, like its own directory, right? Like Tim or Aaron would set up multiple directories for us and multiple, more or less, apps, one for the API and one for the React app or whatever front-end client app we have. But traditionally what I've seen, and you guys can chime in if you've experienced different or done this a little bit different, is we'll deploy the API and then we'll deploy the React app within the www root folder of the API. So that's what I'm going to show here today. So does that make sense from just kind of like an approach that we're taking and kind of comparing and contrasting it to like other approaches that we could take?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So this is our goal. This is what we're going to go ahead and set up. So in order to do that, if I say in .NET as this middleware, I can say use static files. And what that means is anything that ends up in a www root folder can be served up from the API. So that's what this piece of built-in middleware does. And this built-in middleware is use default files, which will say by default, if I were just to go to the root of my app, so say if it, we'll create something maybe like foxhound.com or something like that, it will say by default I can serve up an index HTML, a default HTML. It lists out a number of default files. And in fact, instead of me just guessing what that does, I can say like .NET Core use default files, and I'm sure you can see here, use default files will search for default HTML, default HTML, index HTML, or index HTML. So since we have our file called index HTML, we don't explicitly have to say /index HTML, it'll just serve it up. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yep.
And then the other kind of interesting thing, because we're doing that here, is just this little piece of middleware. So this will say, okay, after I've gotten through all my API routing, like API/blog/whatever, and I don't find a route, well, then I want to just return the index HTML. And that's not going to become super important right now, but it will be once we introduce client-side routing into the React app, which I know DJ has gotten pretty far on, and we'll have that in the code base here relatively quick. And what this is going to do is the client-side routing will all work. So if I go to just blog/add post or something like that, it will work. But if I were then in the browser to refresh or try to bookmark that, it's going to try to search the routing in the API and say, hey, I don't have anything there to return. So what this does, and here's a good blog post about it, and I'll leave it here in the code, you can go pull it up. It will, if it doesn't find one of the routes, it'll return just the index HTML, and then that will allow the client-side routing to kick in. So not super critical at the moment, but and notice that we're only doing this if it's not development. So that means, okay, we're not in development mode, because in development mode we're on two separate ports, right? We're on port 1234 for the client-side app to run, and we're on port 40,000 something for the API. So this doesn't necessarily come into play, but it will when everything's being hosted in the same URL and port. So any questions on that before I move on? I don't necessarily want to gloss over that because there is a little bit of importance, kind of just infrastructure code to get that to work. Have you guys done anything similar in the past with any of your apps? Or have you just kind of hosted those separately? Maybe we haven't done that at all. Okay. So that was a little bit of code that we just put out there to get the deployment to work. So now what I think we'll do is we'll move on to looking at in Azure DevOps. Before we had created a CI build, but here we also created a ready for release build. So I wanted to step through what this is actually doing. So it's very similar to the CI build. Oh, excuse me. The CI build, but what we're going to do is add a couple of additional steps in here. So we're still going to get the sources from GitHub. We're still pulling all the stuff from master. We're still going to do a NuGet restore. We're still going to build the project. We're still going to test the project, the API in particular. But now here we have this publish command. So what this is going to do is take everything and publish everything that we need into a directory that can be deployed. So I could zip this up, but first, this would be a little closer to work too, because we don't have, we're not going to do an Azure app deployment at work. We're just going to do a more or less just a file copy, right? So this will publish it, and we'll look at the artifact that it creates at the end of the day. But this will just be all of our DLLs and any, pretty much, I guess, all the DLLs at this point for the API to be deployed. We have a .NET EF tool install. So ultimately what we want to do is script the SQL that we would want to run in our database. So this command here, can you guys see this okay? Maybe blow it up one. This command here will take our migrations that we've been adding to as we add to the database and create a single database script for us to run. So we'll take a look at this also at the end of it. So what this does is just using the .NET EF CLI to say I want to that my migrations live in the Foxhound app project. My startup project is foxhound.web. And then where do I want to script that? Well, I want to put it, the output, we're going to use some of these built-in Azure DevOps variables, so build artifact staging directory. And if we come up here and look at the publish, this is also the output of the publish. It's going to go to build artifact staging directory. And you can think of that as just some directory on the server, the build server that gets spun up when we create one of these. It's just the directory that the code gets published to. So here we're going to say, okay, we want to put it to that same staging directory, but we want to say /SQL migrations /database migrations SQL. And then the important flag here is this idempotent flag. And what that does is it will say, create me a script for every migration that might be run in my database. And what it'll do is whatever database we point this to run the script in, it'll say, if I don't have any of these migrations already run in here, go ahead and run them. So that's a really slick way of saying, update my database to the current state, regardless of where that database currently is. So I'll stop there for a minute. And any questions on the .NET API publish or how we're getting the SQL script to be created? You guys familiar with that? That is something that we are doing at work in a number of places as well. So you might be using something very similar in our Azure DevOps server instance.
That looks good. I don't think a lot of us in EA at least have gotten there yet, except for maybe some of the most recent apps. But makes sense.
Cool. So that whole first step there is going to be our API build and then getting the SQL out of the API build. The next thing is going to be very similar to our CI build, which is the npm install, which we're just saying go install, run npm install for the client. And then build React here is slightly different than the CI build, but not by much. I think there we just had this first part just saying build it, and then the only reason we're building it there is just to report on any errors. Here we've added the -- out directory flag, which ultimately says, okay, build it, but then also go put the bits somewhere that it built. So here we're going to say artifact staging directory, and this is where it gets maybe slightly odd, but the publish here is ultimately going to publish the foxhound.web folder, right? And it's going to have all the dependencies that it needs, like the app and any of the NuGet packages and anything else like that. So when we say this, we know that there's going to be a Foxhound web, and we're going to kind of prep it by just putting all of that into that www root directory. So that's kind of what I was talking about back in here, is all of this stuff gets built as part of that React step, but we want to move it to the www root directory of the API. So that's kind of more or less what the build is doing, is just saying put it out, put the output here into the www root directory. Then, when we actually publish this, what we want to do, this publish command will say, take everything from that artifact staging directory. So if you remember, that's where our publish is going, that's where our SQL migration is going, and that's where our build React code is going. We want to publish that all out to a name, and by default it just gives you this name of drop, but you could call it kind of whatever you wanted. So we could go ahead and run one of those, just kind of for the sake of time here. I ran one, and nothing's changed since we've done that. So if we go look at that, we can see here it ran all those steps, right? It ran the restore, the build React, all that stuff got run. And what we can do is we can investigate what that artifact looks like. So here it is. So here's our Foxhound web. If you look in here, here's like our app settings. Here's all the DLLs that we would need. Any file, here's mediator, all the NuGet packages that it needs. It packaged all this stuff up for us. And then when we ran our React thing, it built the www root, right? So here's the JavaScript file, the CSS, and the HTML files that got built as part of the React, and then moved it into the www root. I want to talk about one more thing there as well, but then you can also see our SQL migration got built. So if we were to look at this, I guess it wants to download it. you can see this is the SQL that it built. So using that idempotent flag is kind of nice. Look, you can see it says create the migrations table, but only if the migrations table doesn't exist, right? Create the blogs table only if that add blogs and post migration hadn't been run. So that this is a nice way of, regardless, like, think about it at work where we have a dev database, a test database, a production database. You can take this same code and run it on all of those databases. And if you ran it in dev and everything had already been applied, maybe except for this last one, it'll just apply this last one. If you run it in test where maybe you had a couple other things, not run there yet, it might back up to this point. And if you've never run it in production, for example, maybe it would run everything and create the database for the first time. So this is a nice way of it always being able to look at all your migrations, run the same script against any of those databases, and then sync up that database with where your migrations are. I'll stop there for a second. Are there any questions on that? So I said I wanted to walk back to this www root folder for a minute. So if we go back to our pipeline, it's going to open it in a new, actually I think I have it here. One of the things that this build React thing, or parcel build did for us was pulled in the variables for the URL that we wanted. So remember back in here where we had the .env file where we called it API URL? Well, at build time, we don't want it to be localhost. We want it to be whatever our API is going to be deployed to. So if I come back to here and I look at the variables tab, I can now say our API URL might be foxhound.azurewebsites.net/API. And what that's going to do at that build time is find anywhere that process.env.api URL existed and plug in this value. And it does it at build time for us, which is really nice. So if we were to come back and look at the artifact that it created and I were to download this JS file, it's going to be kind of all minified, but I should be able to search in here for foxhound.azure. And you can see down here that it very much did go plug in that variable for me at build time. So this is the JavaScript file that will be pulled down to the client, and then we can say, hey, here's where the API URL exists. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Okay. So from here, we ran that, and now we have this artifact that got created, right? We have our whole app that we ultimately want to deploy. We have our SQL migrations, which we want to run in our SQL database, if we could create that right now. So that is more or less the ready for release build. Are there any questions on the build as a whole and why we're doing that and what it's doing? Okay. So now we'll move on to the release. Well, you know what? I'll tell you what. Before we go release that, because maybe I'll create a new release pipeline, and we will we'll go create our Azure setup. We'll link DevOps into our Azure setup, and then we'll create a release to push all the files into Azure. So I did start spinning up some of this yesterday, but I thought we would just do it as if none of this existed and see if we can get to the same result. And if something kind of goes awry, we'll revert back to what we did yesterday. So again, I want to make sure I leave enough time for questions or comments or to see how familiar this is with folks and kind of how you like the approach. So want to try to make it a little bit interactive, so feel free to kind of ask questions as we go here. So this is the Azure portal. This is the public Azure portal. Once we move to the Gov Cloud for work and we start to get unclassified apps over into the Gov Cloud, it's going to look very similar, and I think a lot of this is going to work very similar. Obviously, there's a lot of governance and things that we need to come through, but the general concepts, I believe, will probably remain the same here as in the public cloud. So this should be a good kind of intro to that. So just kind of a show of folks. Like, I know a number of you were in that Azure training. how familiar are we with kind of Azure in general, just to kind of get a feel for maybe how like the pace that we should take this at?
I have very minimal Azure knowledge.
Okay.
Yeah, for me too.
Okay. Okay, so we'll definitely feel free to ask questions as we go here, because I'll try to go through it relatively slow, but where things don't make sense, I can definitely certainly try to fill in the gaps. So you first start with a subscription in Azure. So I have this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription where I get a number of free credits a month. So I have $150 in free credits, and that'll show in here somewhere. Probably when we get to do this at work, we're going to have different subscriptions set up for us, and subscriptions are more or less the things that are going to incur costs, right? So like to spin up SQL Server, spin up an app service, or something like that, all kind of has some costs associated with it based on what you're creating and how much use you have and things like that. So my guess is, as an organization, we'll have some of these subscriptions already set up for us. Maybe it's per unit, or maybe it's per AIS, or who knows. But anyway, I just wanted to show that, hey, this subscription exists. And right now, I just have some credits in here, but this is where you would link like a credit card, and you would say what's called like a pay-as-you-go subscription, and any costs that are incurred would just get charged to you at the end of every month. So going back home, within a subscription, what we want to do is we want to create a resource group. So I'm just going to create a new resource group. So you can see I created this Foxhound test one, but maybe we'll just create a Foxhound one. Can you guys see the screen okay? Is it useful if I zoom in a little bit?
I can see it okay.
Okay, cool. So what I'm going to do is just add a resource group in here. And it's going to ask me what subscription I want to put this in. So for now, I just have this Visual Studio Enterprise subscription that I'm going to add this to. So we'll call it just Foxhound. And you can see I get this little check here, meaning that that resource group name is available. So it's interesting in Azure, some of the resources have to be named unique to your subscription. Some of them have to be unique across all of Azure. Some of them have to be unique per what's called a tenant. So it kind of depends on the resource that you're going out to create, and we'll look at that a little bit more in a little bit more detail. But here we're going to create just a resource group, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to give it a region. So I guess that's one thing I could talk about real quick is each of the resources that we create can go in a number of different regions. I can I'm going to do this one in East US, but I could go put it in Asia Pacific or Europe or wherever I want it. And this is traditionally, you would put this where your audience is going to be, right? So, and there's ways of distributing this as well, right? Maybe you're a global organization, and I want redundancy across all of these regions, and there's ways of doing that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and click Create for this, and it's just going to take a minute, and you'll see, okay, the resource group in this case just took us a second to create. And when we come back here to our resource groups and refresh, we should see it. Not sure why we're not. So it does exist. Let's see. Not sure why it's not showing up in here. Maybe it just takes a minute. But the idea is, once this does get created, is the resource group is really just like the name says. It's a group of resources. It's something that we can keep collections of our resources in. So, for work, we might do this per app. Maybe every app has its own resource group. That might make sense. Maybe it's per unit. Who knows? So, we can kind of just think about it as a logical grouping of our resources. So here it is. It now shows up here as Foxhound. So any questions on that before I move on? Okay. So we have a resource group. I'm going to go back to it, go to the Foxhound one. So now I can add resources to my resource group. So one of the things that we want to do is we want to add an app service, which is just going to be our web app where we're going to ultimately deploy our code to. And we want to create a SQL database, which we can't do right now because of the apocalypse. So let's go ahead and we'll start by creating a web app, because this we can do right now. So what we want to do is going to say, hey, what's our subscription and what resource group do we want to put this in? So I'm going to put this in the Foxhound one that we just created. And what's our name going to be? Now this does have to be unique across all of Azure because of the website that we're going to get. So if I do Foxhound, it says that's already taken. So somebody actually already has that taken. So maybe we'll call it Foxhound blog or something. So we can do foxhoundblog.azurewebsites.net. And that's going to be the URL that our app's going to be hosted on. Now we can say, hey, do we have a Docker container or do we have code? We're going to say code. I'm going to say we're using .NET Core, and I'm going to say we want this to be hosted on Windows. Now I could say we could host it on Linux or Windows. We can get Linux working, but I think for just the sake of this, and it'll be a little closer to what we're used to, we're going to be on Windows. And then where do I want this to be hosted? I want it actually to be hosted in US East. And then what we also need to do is create an app service plan. So I'm going to create a new app service plan called Foxhound-App Service Plan. And it's ultimately going to go create a new app service plan for me. So you can think of an app service plan as a container for app services. So the app service plan is the thing that actually incurs cost, and the app service is just kind of the application within there. So if you kind of think about it like in like a shared hosting environment that we might be kind of used to, is we have a server, and then within that server we have multiple applications. So if I go to this change size, I can kind of pick what I want. You know, do I want a server that has 1.75 gigs of memory, A-series compute equivalent, and you can see that would cost me $43 a month. If I wanted something a little bit, more robust, I could get, 3.5 gigs of memory and this kind of compute power, and you can see how much that would cost me. And then you can see the different services that you get with whatever hosting tier that we pick. So for this, I'm just going to pick the free tier because it's not going to work anyway because we don't have SQL Server. But you can see, maybe once we do start doing this, maybe we have a dev instance that we pay, only $10 a month for, where maybe some of our bigger production apps might cost a little bit more money to run a month. So I'll stop there for a second. And actually, I'll get this created, and then we'll maybe chat about it a little bit more. So I'm going to say I want the free tier. I can go over to monitoring. I do want to say I want App Insights created, which is a really nice monitoring tool. So we can talk about that a little bit more as well. But I'm going to have it create an App Insights instance for us. I could add some tags to this. I could see that potentially being useful later. If this is a .NET app or a React app or something like that, we could add kind of unique tags, and then we can create it. So I'm going to let this create, and this will take a couple of minutes to do the deployment. So while that's deploying, any questions on kind of about an app service or an app service plan, and kind of how that interaction works? Anything at all? Is that making complete sense on how Azure handles that kind of stuff?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
I just wonder how much money we're going to have whenever we go to the cloud, the Gov cloud.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question, right? Like right now, I wouldn't say our stuff's free, but we have our own, without talking about it too much on here, we have our own infrastructure and everything. But yeah, there's definitely going to be real costs incurred if we're going to be hosting in Azure, or even if Azure doesn't get selected, we end up using AWS. It's going to be very similar from like a pricing perspective, and the setup is, the dashboards and everything look a bit different, but the concepts are all the same over in AWS as well. So it looks like all of these deployments succeeded. So if I come into our resource group now, we can see that we have our Foxhound app service plan, and we have our Foxhound blog, which is our actual app service itself. At this point is where I would like to add a SQL database. So I can kind of explain how that would work. We would, again, go create a SQL database, and a SQL database needs a SQL server, right? But this is what they're not allowing us to do right now, is regardless of what location I pick, I can go over to the Middle East, and it's going to ultimately say, for these free subscriptions, we're not allowing any more SQL servers to be created because they're kind of at capacity as far as all that stuff going. They have a good blog post out there describing how they're reserving resources for first responders and governments and kind of things like that. So they're not kind of in the current climate allowing new resources to be created kind of in these free tiers. There might be some ways that we could get around that. I'd given some thought to like we could create a SQL server and a Docker container and connect to that. But for more of a training exercise, it's not necessarily to get this to work. It's more just to kind of show how all this stuff does work. If we were actually trying to get something out there, I'm sure we could find some ways around it. But just to not overwhelm everyone and then just limit the complexity. And that wouldn't really be like a real life thing anyway. So again, I want to kind of stop for questions or conversation on that if there's any. So unfortunately, what that means is we'll get the app deployed out there, but we're going to get a startup error because it's not going to be able to find our SQL server when it goes to say, hey, pull that connection string and try to spin up the app. It's not going to be able to work. So what that ultimately just leaves us with is our app service, which we can still go ahead and do our deployment to, and we can see that the deployment worked. It's just not going to be able to run. So the next thing that we need to do is then link our Azure DevOps instance with this resource group to say, I'm going to allow Azure DevOps to do the release for me to anything in this resource group. So again, any questions on that before we move on to linking Azure DevOps into Azure itself? Okay. Feel free to speak up at any time, guys, if any of this doesn't make sense. So let's see if this is going to work for us. So what we want to do is in our app, we have this idea of service connection. So you can see I added one for the test connection, the thing that I was playing around with yesterday. And we actually have a link out here to GitHub, right? That's how it's able to pull our code from master from GitHub into here to run any of the builds and releases and such. So what I want to do is a new service connection. And I'm going to click Azure Resource Manager, and that's going to be our connection into Azure. But you can see there's all sorts of other things that I could connect into if I needed to. So I'm going to say here, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to try to do automatic. And it's going to load all my subscriptions. And I'm going to pick the Visual Studio Enterprise one, and then it does look like I need to log in, so that's fine. So now I see my resource groups that I created over in Azure. So I had this test connection, but here I'm just going to pick the normal one that we did. And I'm going to give this a name, and we'll just call it Foxhound Connection. And then say grant access permissions to all pipelines. So that's fine. So I'm going to go ahead and click Save. If all this works, it's going to go create some stuff over in Azure for us. So I will explain that as well. And this is why I wasn't able to get it to work with the GovCloud today, because I didn't have the correct permissions. So we have this connection set up. So let's see what that actually did. So over in Azure, if I come over to every Azure tenant or directory that you have has an Azure Active Directory. So within here, what it did for us is, if I can go to the users, is it users or is it apps? I think it's going to be apps. It created for us this user. So I have a couple of them because I was connecting to multiple resource groups. But ultimately, here's the name that it created for us. So JJH121, that's just my Azure DevOps instance name. Foxhound is the name of the resource group. And then this is a key or just a subscription ID that is routed to. And then here's just an ID that it gives this user. So that's kind of the magic that did when I went and created that new connection. So here's the one that got created today, right? So it's this EF8 or E8F71, right? So if I were to come back here and look at that resource group, and I were to look at the access controls for it, and I were to look at the role assignments, I can see that that one just got created and it gave it contributor rights to this resource group. So what that did was said, okay, in this resource group, anytime in Azure DevOps that I want to use that Foxhound connection, it has access to anything within that resource group. So in this case, it's going to be our app service, and if we were able to spin up SQL Server, it would have been SQL Server there as well. So does that make sense? I think I did walk through that maybe a little bit quick. But the idea is that it's creating the connection between allowing Azure DevOps, my instance of Azure DevOps, into that specific resource group to do the deployments. Anything at all there you guys want to talk about more, need any more clarity? Okay. So now we have this Foxhound connection. So what we want to do now is create a release pipeline to deploy to that. So actually right now, just to kind of prove what's going on here, if I go back in here and we have this Foxhound blog, I should be able to go to foxhoundblog.azurewebsites.net, and it should say something like deploy some code here. So, you know, this site is up, it's running, there's just no code that exists on it. And Azure also gives us the ability, if we drill in here, we can go to what's called these Kudu services. So we'll open that. Where is that? Maybe it's at the app service level. No, I thought it was in here, and there was a way to advanced tools. Here it is. So if I go to advanced tools and I say, yeah, I want to go here. What this does is kind of gives us like a look into the app service itself, right? So this is like the back-end app service. I can come in here, I can look at any of the app settings that it has set up, and we could see how we can add app settings in a minute here. But interestingly, I can go browse all the files that are out here. So if I were to come out here and I were to say, hey, what's actually deployed to this site, you can see there's nothing deployed here right now. I know this is kind of an interesting way of looking at it. It's just kind of showing us the JSON of file structure. But all I'm getting is this host start HTML, which is what this page is rendering here. So it's just a way of, like, you know, think about it as at work. If you were to navigate out to your file share and look at your files, this is just a way of looking at your files as well as seeing any of the app settings that are set up, and you can see any processes that are running on it. It's just anything that's running more or less on that server in that app service itself. So right now, we have this, and we don't have any code published. So the next step that we're going to do is take the build that we just created, that ready for release build, and then publish it out to this foxhoundblog.azurewebsites.net. So let's see, we can close that. And what we'll do is we'll go to the releases now, and we'll create a new release. So I'll just say let's create a new release pipeline. And we're going to use one of these templates just to start, which would be an Azure App Service deployment. And then we'll just call this stage, deploy to Azure. And then we'll come back to that. So what it first needs is an artifact. So an artifact is that build pipeline that we had created earlier in this, or at least we looked at it earlier in this. We want to take the artifact that thing created. So what do we want to pull? You can see it shows us our build pipelines that we have. So we want this ready for release one that we created. And then it's just going to give us this alias for us, which is just _foxhound - ready for release. So it normally just takes the name of the pipeline and just puts an underscore before it. And you can change that to whatever you want, but we'll just leave the default. And we'll say OK. So now this release pipeline is aware of that build artifact that was created. So now we can come into this stage and we can say, well, where do we want to deploy that to? Well, we can pick the Azure subscription here, which is going to be our Foxhound connection. We can say it's a web app on Windows. So remember, if we were doing Linux or we were doing containers or anything like that, we could pick that here. And then where's our app service name? and it's going to go out and it says, hey, these are all the app services that I found within that resource group that this thing is authorized to. So we'll say Foxhound blog. Run on agent's pretty straightforward. It's just going to say, hey, how do I want to run this? I don't have any parallelism or anything going on. It's actually going to run it on spin up a Windows server, a Windows agent rather, to run this on. We could change that to Linux or a number of other things. I'm just going to leave the default for now. And then here's our deploy app service. So it's pulling all the same configuration that we set up here in this deploy, but now we just want to pick what we actually want to deploy to it. So what do we want to deploy? Well, here is our look into that artifact that the build pipeline created. So we have drop, and now we have Foxhound web. So I want to take that whole web directory, which remember includes the www root, which has the index and all of that. I want to deploy that entire directory. In here, it gives us some other places that we can do some web config transforms or add any JSON variable substitutions or anything like that. So it's pretty powerful as far as like being able to reconfigure anything that you want at this point. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a couple of minutes. So at this point, that's really all I needed to do to set up and take the build artifact that we created and publish that to the new app service that we created. So I'm going to go ahead and save that. Actually, I can't. We'll just call this Foxhound release. Save that. Say OK. So if I wanted to at this point, I could have different stages, right? I could say maybe if we had a test instance, deploy to test first, and then after it was successfully deployed to test, then create another stage. I can clone this, and I could say copy that to production, and then copy that to QA, or you can think of a million different scenarios that we could create these stages for. I would say at work, traditionally what we end up doing is having like a dev, test, and production stages, and then after each one of these, you can say I have different post conditions that I would want to run, right? So maybe I would say I can only get to the test one if these people, I could put different approvers in here. Maybe I can only get to production if my manager approves, or my manager and my project manager approve. So we certainly have some of that kind of infrastructure set up at work that we can, we could set that up. We can also have gates in here, which is pretty interesting, and we can add different deployment gates. So one thing that I've been interested in doing once we get the get rid of that portfolio and get the more robust, I forget what they're calling that, the plan view tooling in there, is they want to know of all of the versions of an app that we have deployed out there. Well, what we could do is invoke an API call here. So once the thing gets deployed to production, say, we could call the plan view API and send it all the detail that we would need to automatically register a new version of our app has been published, right? So there's some interesting stuff we could do from an automation standpoint where we don't have to remember to go add it to the different maintenance systems and any kind of configuration control that we have. So kind of interesting. So let's go ahead and run this and see what happens. So, and I've been talking here for a while. Do you guys have any questions on what I did there? Any comments on how that's working? Does that all make like complete sense?
So far, so good.
Cool. So I'll go ahead and create a release at this point, and I'm just going to say go ahead and create it. So we'll come over here and we can see that it created this. It's queued, and it should spin up here in a second, and we'll see it actually get deployed. So we can even follow it on here if we wanted. So here you can see it initialized it. It spun up the build server. Now, at work we have like just a single build server. It doesn't spin one up every time. It downloaded the artifact, so that just pulled the artifact that was created by the build, and now it's going to take that and deploy it out to the app service itself. So it should just take maybe 30 seconds. Yep. So now our app service is out there, And if we were to come back over again to these like Kudu services, right, and we go into files, and we can go into the site, and we can see exactly what was published out here. Well, now look at everything that we have, right? We have our Fluent validation, you know, all the mediator packages. Here's our Foxhound app DLL. So everything got deployed out here. And if we were to come find the www root directory, let me see if I can find that. We're going to see our React app got deployed. Here's our app.js. Here's our index.html, our CSS, etc. So our entire app is now published out here. But remember what I said, because we didn't have SQL Server, if I actually navigate to the app, it's not going to work. But we'll look at it anyway. So if I come out here and I were to load this, I'm going to get probably some sort of process failed to start thing, right? So I unfortunately get this error because, well, I'll show you exactly why. What it's doing is in startup, which runs when the app starts up, it's going to say, where is that code? Here, it's going to say, go find the Foxhound connection and say, I want to use SQL Server. Well, we don't have a Foxhound connection because we don't have a SQL Server instance to connect to. But I do think it might be worth showing how that connection would be set up. So if I did have a Foxhound connection, so remember right now in app settings, that lives here, right? We have Foxhound connection under connection strings, and it says, you know, our servers, whatever, here, right? What we would do in Azure is we would go here, and in our app service, so I'm in the app service itself, there's configuration. And what I can do is just simply add a connection string, and I would call this just Foxhound connection. I would say the type SQL Server, actually probably SQL Azure in this case, and the value would be our connection string to SQL Server in Azure. And if we were able to spin up SQL Server in Azure, you can see in there it would just give you the connection string, and then you would just plug in your password or whatever, however you would want to connect out to that. And it's worth noting that all of these are encrypted at rest. So if I were to go back into here, and I think it does say that somewhere on this page, connection strings are encrypted at rest and transmitted over encrypted channel. So it handles all of that for you. So you can safely put your password in here in you know, more or less plain text. But when it's used, it's all going to be encrypted. And as it's sitting here, wherever it's being stored, in something called Key Vault, and we can get into all that. But it ultimately is going to always be stored encrypted. So I'm sure once we start talking to security about these things, there are going to be a lot of questions on that kind of stuff. But it is pretty secure. And this is the place where you'd also go add any of your other application settings. So, you know, it set up some App Insights instrumentation stuff by default for us. But if we just had, you know, like our default logging level or pretty much anything else that is going to be in the app settings here, you know, you could override how you want the logs to look. You can override different API, like maybe this API has to talk out to other APIs and it needs tokens or needs usernames and passwords or even just the URLs. That would all be configured within the app service itself.
Hey, John, my understanding is that configuration uses Key Vault behind the scene.
It does. It uses Azure Key Vault there. So Azure Key Vault's another service that we could spin up on our own, but each instance, I think each tenant ultimately gets its own Azure Key Vault by default that it can store all this stuff in. And Key Vault's like, it's some crazy like 256 or 512-bit encrypted storage for things like passwords or anything else that you would want to remain secret. That's a good point, Tom. So any questions on that? So I think that's all I really had to go through. I didn't know, I didn't really expect it to take an hour. I thought it might have taken like an hour and a half. But that's the general gist. So assuming we had SQL Server set up there and we were to go out here, we would see our app render, right? We would see our app come up. You know, we could start adding blogs to it, and you would see all that functioning. Unfortunately, we just can't create the SQL Server instance because of the resource constraints in Azure at the moment for these free accounts. So what do you guys think about that? Is that didn't seem too hard, or did it seem like, hey, that's all completely brand new? I need to walk through that all again on my own to figure that out. All right. Well, that's all I had necessarily prepared for today. If there's anything else you'd like to talk about, or if you want to shift gears into some other, we can shift gears back into any kind of programming, React or API code, or we could talk about Azure more. We could create additional resources or things out here if that's of interest. Kind of leave it up to you guys where you want to take it.
Was there any desire to look at some of the recent commits? I think you said you got the markup stuff working, John. Is that correct?
Yeah, sure. We could take a look at that. We could definitely take a look at that. Before we move on from that, I guess that's a good transition. We can look at the issues that are out there. If the folks are on the call that have taken some of those things, to see kind of where they stand, and maybe talk about if there's anything else folks would be interested in trying to build. Again, as a training exercise. If it's becoming cumbersome too, it's just a training exercise. So, but before we move into that, I guess any other Azure related questions or anything that we went over here today? What do you guys think? Just trying to get a feel for what how you think that's working, and if you think that's cumbersome, or you think there's a lot involved in doing that. If you think it's easy, just kind of any kind of feedback. Okay. Well, yeah, we can certainly look at the app here for a minute, and we can see what folks have done, and we can take a look out at the backlog of stuff and see where we're at. So there were a couple of pull requests that came through. Come look at the closed ones here. Tommy broke out the add blog to its own component. So there's now an add blog component that's out there instead of all being on one page. I added the post with a markdown editor so we could take a look at that. And then we did look at the setup project for deployment. So let me make sure I have the latest version here. I'm in master. Just do a quick pull. Make sure I actually have it all pulled down. And it looks like the server is running, and then see if the backend server is running. It is. So we should be able to see what the app looks like now. We should load these blogs. Okay. So right now everything is kind of just thrown on this page. And DJ, I know I was working with him a little bit earlier, and there is an actual open PR out here for this nav bar. So before we dive into some of the code, are you guys getting notifications for PRs out there? Maybe we can talk a minute how we want to run this. If we're actually going to keep adding features to this, I think it's worthwhile that we get kind of notifications that the PRs are out there and kind of decide, do we want required PR approvers? I certainly don't mind looking at it. But are there others that are interested in kind of doing the PRs as well as just submitting them?
I think it's worthwhile. As long as people are willing to review the PRs, to have people review them so that we can get better at, what we're trying to accomplish here.
I completely agree with you. Are you guys familiar with the PR process in general? We may have glossed over that when we set all this stuff up. Were you guys doing that at work as kind of a standard for your guys' code?
I think once again it comes back to newer apps are using it more. Yeah.
Sure. But is the process familiar with everybody? Because I know, if you're not familiar with it, it just kind of seems all very foreign, right?
It is kind of funny to me, the PR process, because when I heard Tim's the concern about doing pull requests and TFS, I was like, why the heck do you do pull requests? And the history of pull requests really kind of comes from GitHub. and the whole forking mechanism is not a Git feature; it's a GitHub feature. And so the idea is, because GitHub was mostly designed for open source, is that you have a repo, somebody wants to contribute to the repo, but you don't know them exactly, or somebody's like, I'm just going to take this, I have ideas to improve this. And so what they do is they fork your repo, and then they have their own set copy of the repo that is forked, and then they would do their enhancements or any additions. And then what would happen is they would then create a pull request for the original repo, to say, hey, I've made these changes, I've added these features to your software library or whatever. Would you like to incorporate them into the main repo? And then the person would review it and say, okay, you're not doing anything shady, I will incorporate it in.
Yeah, I was gonna just so I think this Up for Grabs site has it, and I can actually find .NET like runtime, like the whole thing's up here. So if I go over to like, this is like the .NET, like the whole framework, right? They do all this out in the open in a public GitHub repo, right? So like what Chris was talking about is they have all these issues out here, right? They have like 5,000 issues, and I can come out here and I can look for somewhere in here. I think it says like Up for Grabs, and let's see. I'm not finding it right here, but anyway, like you could see all these issues that are out here, and you could come out here right now and you could grab one of these, kind of read through what the issue is, create a branch off of their code, and submit a pull request back into it. And they've been doing that quite a bit now. So like the general population can go, you find a bug in the .NET framework itself, you can go fix it, submit a pull request. I mean, you have to follow their guidelines and everything, and the .NET Microsoft team will look at it, and if they like it, they might provide some comment back and forth, and if they like it, they'll ultimately commit that into their repo. So that's kind of along the lines of what Chris was just talking about, is like any of these open source projects. That's kind of how that works. You have anything else to add to that, Chris?
No, I mean, that's pretty much it. Yeah, and I don't know what the preferred method for a lot of groups are, like whether it's branching, or obviously if you know everybody, branching is probably the preferred, but forking is another thing. And as you can see at the top there, that particular one has been forked 702 times. So.
This Up for Grabs is a cool site too. If you're looking to, like, if you wanted to get started on some sort of open source project, you can come out here and see all the open source projects that exist out here, and they all have Up for Grabs. They have like different tags on here that you can, if you're interested in looking at something, there's everything from probably super difficult stuff to super simple stuff out here. So kind of interesting. Okay. So yeah, back to here then. So we were talking about the pull requests that did come into here. So I think the initial question that I had asked was, do we want to be doing these pull requests? And I agree with DJ. I think it's beneficial as a training exercise, and then when we get back into the office, just to make sure we're all on the same page, because we can do the exact same thing there. Granted, it won't be in GitHub; it'll be in Azure DevOps, but the process is identical. So if you're not already, I think if you log into your account and you can go to settings, somewhere in here under notifications, you can say you want notifications for PRs. I'm not sure exactly where that is, because I know I'm getting the notifications. Like I got one from DJ this morning, like in wherever my personal email is. I got like a thing that says, hey, there's a PR out here. Is anybody else getting those by default?
I I didn't get them.
Jace.
I'm getting them.
You are getting them.
I forget how I set it up though.
But you did go. Did you have to go do something in particular to get it to set up?
I think so.
Okay. I mean, it might be useful if you got, for those of us that want to kind of like actively contribute to this thing and like, build something here over the next month or however long we're going to be out. I would recommend figuring out how to get the notifications turned on. It might just be as easy as going over to notifications and saying active.
And John, I don't know if you've gotten any yet, since we just kind of started this, but there's the nice thing about GitHub, especially with JavaScript projects, like it will scour your package.json file. And if there's a dependent library that has a security vulnerability, like it has bots that run. And so speaking of pull requests, what'll happen is you'll get a notification that, this particular package, and I may have an old one in my email, I could send to somebody if they want to see, that this particular package that you're using has a vulnerability. And what they will do is they're like, would you like us to auto-resolve it for you? And they will auto-resolve it, and basically they'll create a branch, they'll modify your package.json, and then they will send you a pull request, and then basically you can merge that back in to your normal repo. Obviously, it's up to you to fix, if that particular version changes something, but it does do that, which is kind of cool. I don't know if everybody could get notifications on that, or if only the owner gets notifications on that, but that is one of the features of GitHub that's interesting.
So it looks like that is really cool. I have not seen that in this project yet, but I would be interested in seeing what that looks like. This thing said it looked like there was something that you could click to get notifications on. I was just kind of doing a quick Google here. It says choose an issue or pull request to subscribe to. But I would just want to do Sorry guys, I'm just not as familiar with GitHub. So it does look like, okay, I could like pick this one and then like somehow subscribe to it in particular. But I would want to subscribe to kind of all of them. So I guess I'm not super familiar with.
Yeah, I'm trying to look through my settings too, and under my settings and notifications, it looks like by default, email notification preferences are automatically checked for pull request reviews and pushes. So I'm not sure why I didn't get. I don't know if anyone else has done like a pull request or whatnot for the application recently, but
Tommy's done 2 or 3 or 4 of them. I've done 2 or 3 or 4 of them. I think Ryan had a couple of them.
Yeah, and I have not been getting any notification. Does it matter like how each individual person is set up in this project? Like do you have to like go in there and set us up individually to be like, like administrators or contributors or something?
I think you are all contributors because like under manage access here, here's everybody and everybody's a collaborator, right? If you're not, let me know. We can certainly add you. But it looks like everybody on this call, maybe except for Dan. I don't know. I'm not seeing you in here. If you're interested, you can send me your personal email and we can add you here if you have a GitHub account, if you're interested in contributing. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like it shouldn't be that hard. Like I'm not even seeing this little subscribe thing like it says I should be seeing. I don't know. But I would recommend, if we're going to keep moving with this thing, which it sounds like there's some interest in doing that, then, getting the emails is going to be kind of pertinent so you know when there's PRs out there. You could also go...
that one out there, that navbar, did you get the pull request notification for that one?
For which one?
The navbar?
I did. Yeah, let me see. Like,
I didn't get that one, and that's when I looked at it. It looks
Yeah,
like you're the
I
only
got
one
it.
reviewer for it.
I got that one. I got the email for the nav bar.
Huh? Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, I know Gmail categorizes it as forum for me, but it also still hits my main inbox. So the only thing I could think of is maybe if it automatically is bidding it somewhere that's not your inbox. But if you didn't set it up, I don't know why I would be doing that.
Timmy, you didn't do anything in particular like get that set up, did you?
No, not that I remember. I mean, I've been getting them since it looks like the end of last month. I think when we initially set this all up, so I might have turned something on at that point, but I can't think of it right now. I'll see if I can find anything.
Sure.
Hey, John, I forwarded you two of the sample emails.
To my which account?
Your Gmail. I don't know if they got there yet, but they're.
There we go. So here's. So this is saying like this minimalist
Right.
project is moderate to very interesting.
So one thing I noticed is I know only some of us are watching the GitHub area. I don't know if that. It seems to mention something about be notified of all conversations. Maybe that's why some of us are getting them and some aren't.
That would probably make sense.
Because I know DJ is not. If you click on the 7, DJ is not one of those 7.
Yeah, mine's set to not watching.
So I would probably set that to watching. Good call, Tim.
Yeah, and John, in one of those emails too, there's the first one. I think it says I think you have to turn it on. It says you have automatic security updates enabled. So you might need to turn that on for it to send you those.
Okay. That's interesting. So is that under security here or something?
I think it's under regular settings, just in general. For I'm trying to remember. I'll have to find it.
Yeah, we'll take a look at it.
It might just be under options, but it's been
Security alerts.
Yeah. Okay. So it's probably on by default.
Cool.
By default.
Okay, so I think we came to the bottom of that. If we all, so that's good. We'll get the security alerts. If you want to actively contribute to the project, let's go turn on the watching in here. Looks like a couple you just did. Looks like we got Tommy and DJ in there. So that's good. That's good. So let's see. The things that we've added to the project, looking back at the PRs that are out here and the closed ones. So real quick, like we'll walk through what these did. So breakout blog to its own component. So we can see here that Tommy took the everything that was in just blogs for the add component, all this code that's in red here, and moved it to just an add blog component, which is really nice, right? Because that's kind of the idea of React here. Is we want these small components that just do its own thing. So we have that add blog component, and if you come back here to the conversation, you can see some of the conversation that Tommy and I had back and forth, and said, hey, here's a suggestion. There was some more in here somewhere. Maybe that was it. So we had a little conversation back and forth on that one. The other ones that are out there are the Markdown editor that I added. So Ryan came out and did this one and said, he was questioning the way that I was using one of these use state commands and passing that through. Went and looked it up and figured out, hey, he was right. I probably shouldn't be doing that. I went and fixed it. He liked it. I merged that in. So that Markdown editor, what that does is that's this thing. So if we wanted to add a post, we could say, my first post or something like that. And this Markdown editor is pretty slick. So I can say, testing, and I can do a side-by-side preview. So this is like what the ultimate rendered thing would be. You guys all familiar with Markdown? So I set this up so we can, you could say, this is some bold text, and it'll bold. You can do all that stuff. If we wanted to add a code block, we could. You could say something like public static void main. And you see how we get like the syntax highlighting and everything over there. So like if we wanted to, come in here and grab some code, whatever, and just paste it in here, you get all that, which is quite nice. So this is just using a free online library I found called like React Simple Markdown Editor. It also has local storage, so if you can see this was auto-saved at 11:19, so if I were to like navigate away from the page altogether and come back, that's all going to be saved there, which is pretty nice. And then like when I say my first post again and I actually add this, and it went and added it to the database. Now granted, I'm not like redirecting anywhere, but if I come back at this point, my local storage is going to be emptied because it's smart enough to know that I saved that back. You can also do images, so that's something that I could work on or somebody else could work on is with this library. If we click and drag an image in here, you can give it an endpoint. So in our API, we could say like an upload image API, and if I click on this or click and drag an image into here, it'll take that image, upload it to our server somewhere, and then put a reference to it, like right in our blog post. So that might be something worth doing as well. Any questions on that, like what was accomplished by both Tommy's add blog component or this add post component? Okay. Looking out at the issues that are here, maybe we'll spend a minute walking through here. We have blog UI validation, edit blog. Looks like Tommy maybe was going to take that one. View comments on post, Horvat. List blog. So maybe we'll just kind of start here. I know like site navigation. We'll start down here. DJ has a PR out there now, so I'll certainly go take a look at that today. If anybody else wants to take a look at that today, but I think we might want to lay out some ground rules on like, okay, if a PR is like approved by one person, is that enough just to get it in? Do we want to wait for multiple people? Do we care?
I think as long as one person does like a review of it, just to have like some sort of dialogue.
I think I agree. I think I agree with that. And again, it's just a training app, so like as things change, and we don't really have necessarily like requirements or anything that we're following. If we find some refactors or something, someone can submit a PR just to do a refactor if they see something that they want to be better. How about that?
I like it.
Cool. Breakout, add blog to its own component. So I think this is done, right, Tommy? That's one that's completed.
Yep, that one's done.
So we'll just close that issue. Come back here. List blogs. Is Mike Berger on the call? He is. So I think, Mike, that one was just like taking this and making it better.
Mm-hmm.
You there?
Hello?
Yep, there you are.
Okay.
Is that something you're still working towards?
Yeah. I thought I was going to get it done yesterday, but there are a couple little hiccups, so. But yes, I'm working on it.
Okay. So just submit a PR, when that's done. Add authentication. I know I talked to Polero a little bit, and he set up a OpenID Connect server, which was interesting. So, we could talk more about that. Maybe that's a session you want to do, Chris, at some point, if that's something that you have time or that interests you.
Yeah, maybe. Depends on the time.
Sure.
But
add a comment to a post. Horvat's not on here today. View comments on a post, very similar. Edit blog. Tommy, looks like you got that one.
Right. That was essentially going to add an edit link to Mike's listing.
Okay.
And then navigate that to a new page and allow the owner and the title right now to be updated. And if we need to restrict that down to just like the title and not being able to change the owner.
Makes sense.
But for now, I'm just going to let both go through, and then we can refactor it as needed.
Makes sense. So you're kind of relying on the list blog and maybe even some of the navigation to
Right. But for now, like even if I like have I have like a branch right now where I just add in the edit link to it, and then we can
Gotcha.
pull it. And then if Mike beats me to it, then I'll just like pull it back down and re-add it.
Makes sense. Makes perfect sense.
Mhm.
And then blog UI validation.
Question on that, real quick question on that.
Yep.
As elementary as this seems, in React, like when you I should say on an MVC app, like I would go out and add an href.
Yep.
And have it edit, and it would just go through like a jQuery type of routine. Like here, it's almost like we have to build a link with a to, or is there like an href with an on click, but then it's like binding the IDs to it. There's a lot of it seemed pretty high level to me, but then as I went through it, I'm thinking, am I doing something completely wrong in building an href, or is it a link to? Or a button gives me an easy action to it, but
so that I completely understand your question. So like if we look at the React router, right, there's going to be React router DOM. That's what that is what DJ was working on right now. So why can't I find the docs? Just go to the freaking docs. But, so in here, if you look at this, it's going to be link to, right, and that's going to build the URL down to this router, right? So you can do that. The interesting thing that you're going to want to look up is how to incorporate this with the Material UI framework that we pulled in, right?
Okay.
So Material UI link router. I'm sure somebody's done this.
But I can't find it. I just want to make sure I was on the right path.
So here, here's a pretty good Stack Overflow that kind of looks like however you would go create to do that, right? So like maybe you create a simple link component of, that's our own that takes Material UI styling and then embeds that React router link type into it. Just a quick glance, it looks like that might be what that's doing. But we can iterate over that too. Just try to get some working. And then
I'll let you know what I find.
Makes sense. So for the rest of you guys on the call, if you're interested in adding something here, I mean, we can create some new tasks out here. Is there anything that folks are interested in trying to take on? And again, we don't necessarily have to have an issue out here. It's just kind of nice for all of us looking at it. And again, it's just a training exercise. So it's as you get time or as you want to get creative with some of this training time that we need to do being out of work. And if you're interested in kind of like building an app in a real life like-ish scenario. Okay. Well,
do we have like a not necessarily an issue, but do we have like a task to see a page where like it just shows just your posts or just your blogs?
Yeah, I think that might make sense. Like some sort of like, hey, what's out there page, right? Like I was given that just 2 minutes of thought would be like, maybe, we have a list of all the blogs or whatever, but maybe like a home page, it shows like the most recent posts across all blogs.
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Or like just your blogs or something like that. I'm not sure.
Right. That's tough until we get some sort of authentication mechanism in there because it doesn't necessarily know who you are.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, like the same sentiment is there. So yeah, I like that idea. Maybe we'll add one just for show most recent posts. Show posts maybe across all blogs. Maybe show most recent posts up to 10. I don't know, like what, across all blogs. And that'd be interesting because you would probably create some sort of API method to go get that and then like a React component and maybe a link or something to put all that together. So that's a decent, high level task. So again, feel free to get creative, and I don't care if there's an issue out here or not. If you do think of something, maybe add the issue and create a PR for whatever you want there. Not not really too big of a deal. It's just a training app. Anything else, guys? Anything else you guys want to talk about today?
I'll just say this too, and if anybody wants to look at other things too, I mean, there are plenty of things that like Redis and
Mm-hmm.
caching and things to look at. So don't necessarily just lock yourself into React or something. With that said, too, I was contacted by one of the training provider companies. If anybody is interested, I know they're doing a C# training, which maybe beneath pretty much everybody on this call at this point, but they were planning on doing one. I think the week of the 20th, maybe there's a class.
Where were they doing that, Chris? Is it something put on by
Virtual.
the lab or?
No, it's ProTech, so
Okay.
it'd be virtual. But yeah, I mean, I'm still looking into. I need to probably get on the React training itself and see about maybe doing that. I don't know what the protocol is right now with work and how we typically, sign up and do all that stuff. So if people would have to go in and sign up or we'll have to see about that. But maybe since we can work, from home and stuff, I'm pretty sure virtual training is not off the table. So I'm probably encouraged. And so
you're talking about like a formal React training from like Learning Tree,
Yeah.
one of those things that we normally go to some hotels to do.
Yeah. So yeah. So maybe we do that. So we'll see. But there's lots of other things too. If people want to attend, now's probably the best time to ask because you can probably get away very easily taking it from home. So
I know some of the bigger conferences that were happening in the spring are all going to be virtual now. I don't have any of the dates in front of me, but I think Microsoft Build, which was going to be in May, so like we might be back to somewhat normalcy by then. But there was like a Facebook conference and a Google conference and a couple other things going on too that were all going to be virtualized.
yeah. So are they going to still charge like a ton of money for it, or
I have no idea. I don't know.
Or are they going to make it free like the .NET Conf?
I don't know.
My understanding is that was going to all be online and free at this point. They're issuing refunds if you had registered for Build. No, there you have it right on your screen, I think.
Yeah.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, that's not till May, but who knows where we'll be in a month and a half from now. So, yeah. All right. Well, it kind of sounds like we're wrapping up here. Is there interest in doing more of these live shares? And if so, what topics would you want to discuss? Do we want to... I'm trying to think of reasons like we would get back together. We ended early today. We went through some of the Azure stuff. We could meet periodically again to just go through like the different PRs that people have thrown out there to like kind of just discuss the app in general. Just trying to gauge like interest, to see what people are interested in doing.
I mean, me personally, like any pull request that someone's doing and someone's reviewing it, I would like to, have just kind of like a discussion about it.
Sure.
Just so that I can learn like how what other people's development practices are and whatnot, just so I can learn more of like best practices or if someone has a better way of doing something. I just would like to know how all that
Yep. I think a good way of doing that too, DJ, is like if we, assuming we get a bunch of PRs out here, go back and look at the old ones and kind of see the conversations that happened there and kind of see the code that's being committed, and to make sure you understand what all that's doing.
Yeah.
Or even in the open PRs, it's a good opportunity to just ask questions in there. Say, hey, I don't understand why that's doing what it's doing. Just to put a comment in the PR, and then we could always have a video chat and a screen share or something to get into more detail.
Yeah, I can. I'll look through GitHub. I didn't realize that it had like all those features where like it showed like conversation history and stuff like that. So I'll go through that and take a look.
Sounds good. So as far as the future of these kind of like group meetings that we've been doing and recording and all that, is there still value in doing these? Are there topics that we would want to explore more? You guys are probably tired of listening to me talk all day. If there's anybody else that's interested, like Ryan did the one GraphQL training, which I thought was really good. If there's any other kind of just topics in general that somebody's interested in presenting on.
Could be on anything too. So think of this as exploratory, whatever. So if you want to look at, maybe you want to take some time and you want to look at something, doesn't have to be right away. Like I don't know, look at different types of databases. Something like Cassandra or something. Maybe see if something like that would be useful. Maybe look at Redis, look at different architectural patterns, different languages, like anything,
Yep.
And
those are all great suggestions. Again, I certainly don't mind showing some of that stuff if it's in my wheelhouse. I'm sure you guys have watched me fumble through a lot of this stuff. So
I think Knief wouldn't mind doing like an F# thing.
Okay.
I don't see him on the call, but he'd probably love doing that. He uses it every now and then.
We can use the training team that we have in here. I don't know if you guys have set yourselves up for like notifications or alerts on there, but we could use that for, hey, I'd like to see this, or I'd like to give a training on that, or even for the PRs that are there, you can go say, hey, I have this PR out there. Would somebody mind looking at it because no one's looked at it yet? So we can use that training team that we have there to our advantage as well.
Yeah, maybe we can make a tab too or something where I don't know if there's a particular tab type that if somebody wants to see something or somebody wants to.
Right. So right now, like you can get to the GitHub repo up here. The wiki contains the YouTube videos that we've had, different links out to different things, which is pretty good. And then back in we could create different channels in here if that's useful, or just kind of use the general channel and just kind of direct all conversation to there. But you can always subscribe to this by, where is it? There's like a channel notifications, and you're going to put that to banner and feed to get any of the conversation history that happens in here. You'll get little notifications for it.
If people want to go over Azure more, I can do a deep dive into Azure, different things, how it. I've learned a lot in the past couple of days from the AZ 103 side of the house. Some of the things that are coming down, also how Microsoft kind of architects Azure a little bit for use. So if you guys want to go over that, we can do that.
That's something I would be a little bit interested in.
And
I'd be interested in that as well, Chris. Particularly like some of the VNet setup and what that looks like.
Yeah, we could go over that too. There's a lot of new stuff they're adding. I know, John, at one point you had mentioned the Power Apps from Microsoft.
Mm-hmm.
Right now that's in preview in Azure.
GovCloud just got that too, I saw.
I don't believe they have that yet. They have the Power BI embedded, but they do not have the Power Platform. So, was just looking at that this morning.
There was
So-
another blog I was on that I was reading about it the other day. But anyway, yeah.
It may be coming. There's some things that are Microsoft seems to focus a little bit more on certain things when moving to the GovCloud, and like Bastion was very fast. I'm sure this is going to make it over there, but
Right. So according to this, on March 26th, they've added Power Apps to the GovCloud.
I'm in there right now. I don't see him though.
Okay.
yeah,
it's weird.
they added Power BI embedded
Okay.
to the GovCloud right now. But the actual Power Apps, unless they don't have it. So if you go to the commercial cloud, it's under something called Power Platform. So if you search for Power Platform, you will find it. Search in the top bar.
Gotcha.
And
That's not in the
but-
GovCloud now.
nah, that's not there.
But yeah, I mean, that stuff's pretty powerful too. I mean, that allows you to kind of integrate some stuff automatically. Like, I think you'll see a lot of the classic, like, hey, what if I get a Twitter, a tweet with at whatever, and it comes through here, then take that and kick off some other process or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's very much their ServiceNow thing. Kind of, you got an app, you can build like a form, and then the automate is kind of like the workflow and stuff.
They call a lot of this like
Well,
low code.
that's all the logic apps, right? Well,
Kind of.
what's the difference between the Power Platform and the Power Apps and the logic apps? I guess.
This is more probably for like simpler interface. This is more like WYSIWYG, probably for like end users. Like a
That's
higher.
kind of like is this like your no code like
This
switch
is,
type thing?
yeah, this is more for
More
like
low
your
code.
not developer but power user type person. So not quite, kind of the people that would like invent like something like STS or something. So it's more like that than. Yeah, and the commercial redirects out, so I don't know like how exactly they're working it with Azure. What their plan is, but there are. It's actually kind of surprising to me some of the things they're adding right now. Is a lot is related to control of like permissions, like blueprints is a big thing.
Well, I mean, I would be interested in something if you wanted to present on something like that or talk about it in like a little bit more detail.
Yeah.
And we can, I'll kind of leave it up to you on maybe when we want to schedule that. I know traditionally at the end of these we've like scheduled the next one for a few days out. I don't know if that's something we want to continue to try to do, or maybe shoot for next week, or whatever works for everyone.
Yeah, let me see, because I'm like super busy. So I'll say, hopefully next week and stuff, and we can go through stuff and.
And it sounds like there's still some interest from like our earlier conversations and kind of just continuing to build out this little React app that we have. I know that's something that kind of interests me as well, just to learn some better practices and just kind of do some of that work just to get more familiar with it. So.
Yeah, one of the cool things I learned recently with Azure is there's I like to use the CLI a lot, and so the CLI always returns JSON to you. When you're doing that vice the PowerShell. And the cool thing is there's a option on it that accepts a query, and there's this thing called James Path. And what it is, it's almost like XPath for JSON. and you can do really neat queries with it, and it'll actually do projections, which is neat. So you can take a JSON and it will kind of change out the formatting, or if you want to rename the keys, and just do like a subselect, which is really useful when you're working in the Azure CLI, because like say you're pulling a list of subscriptions or something, you're getting the entire JSON object out of there, but maybe you only need the ID of the subscription, so of a particular subscription, so you could write a query to pull that. Right, pull that particular. Yeah, so it's pretty neat. And what's neat is even after it does the projection, you can still apply the CLI output to it, which is one of the standard commands on it to do like a tab separated value or a table format. So,
very cool. Very cool. So yeah, maybe some more to come on that stuff then, Chris. If you want to look at your calendar, maybe, and then kind of get back to us maybe in this Teams channel, and then we can schedule the next one of these.
Okay, yeah.
And I guess is for everyone else on the call, if you have, I know I've done a couple just like small one-on-ones with folks to like explain some things or like go into more deep dives on stuff. As long as I'm available, I'm certainly up to doing stuff like that. So feel free to reach out. Anything else then, guys? Anything else you want to talk about today or discuss? Seems like we got some issues out here that people are going to work on, and there's a couple PRs out there right now.
All right. I'm all set. Thanks, John.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, thanks for coming. We'll maybe this week or next week we'll look for something and we'll get another one of these set up.
Sounds good.
All right, guys. Take it easy.
See ya.
Have a good one.
Bye.